But there is a lot we could say about this, but in the interest of time, we're going to move through the first couple of PowerPoints fairly quickly, because rather than get too tied down with past thinking about sin, I want to get to more contemporary reflections on sin, because I think that's material that might be more interesting to you and that you might find more worthwhile in terms of interacting with your own thoughts and reflections and the discussions we'll have later on. So, Dave, if you throw up the first slide. And basically, what I want to suggest to you is we use the language of mystery a lot in religion. And I'm one of those people who loves mystery stories. I read Hercule Poirot, and I read Maigret in Paris, and I read Sherlock Holmes and contemporary mystery stories. And if you think about those, it's really what mystery stories are about for most of us, really. They really should be called problem stories, because basically they're problems that a detective has to resolve, has to find the answer to. Whereas mystery, the way theologians and philosophers talk about it, is mystery is not a problem you solve. It's a human reality that is too complex and too vast to ever simply solve it. Rather, you live with a mystery, and your own experience of it may give you insights and may give you certain ways of talking about it. But a genuine mystery is not something you can ever analyze and break down and define as if it's just simply a mathematical equation that if we work it out on the board, we've got it. And so we're comfortable with the mystery of God and talking about God as beyond our comprehension and beyond being captured by human language. But I want to suggest to you that the same thing is true about the working of grace in our lives. That's a mystery, how the Holy Spirit works in our lives. And also, I want to suggest sin is fundamentally a mystery. And so what we're not going to talk about is the definition of sin today, but I'm going to talk more about images and metaphors of sin. Because in many ways, when you're dealing with mystery, it's the poets and the artists who give us insight into the reality of the mystery of sin. But all of those attempts are just, might say, partial insights. We never get a full, defined, comprehensive treatment of sin anywhere in the Christian tradition. There are more or less insightful things to say. But our tradition has used all kinds of language to talk about sin. Dave, if you'd go to slide 2.
Sure. Yeah.
One of the reasons why we use lots of different images for sin is because we're trying to talk about several things that are related but are also quite different. For example, think about the language of original sin. The idea that you and I inherit a situation where our relationship with God is not what it should be. That somehow, right from the very beginning of our existence, there is something askew, something that isn't quite right. And so we tell stories like Adam and Eve. We talk about snakes that talk and seduce people into biting into apples they shouldn't eat. We use all kinds of images and language to try and get at this idea that part of our experience of sin is that you and I know that right from the beginnings of our story, there is something that's a little off-center in the human encounter with reality. A second way we talk about sin that's quite different than the first way, because the first way we say we inherit this, that even children have original sin. But the second way we talk about sin is that sin involves our freedom, that we use our freedom to turn from God. In some ways, you and I are culpable or blameworthy for how we live our lives, because sometimes we use freedom not to learn how to love, but we use our freedom to reject love, to alienate ourselves from God or other people. Well, that's a different reality than saying we inherit a situation that I didn't bring about. A third way we talk about sin is sometimes sin is spoken of as it hampers our freedom. That sometimes to be in a situation of sin is to be unfree. We feel trapped at times in certain situations. That there are people who at times find themselves seemingly incapable of breaking out of a situation that they may be terribly dissatisfied with, unhappy about, feel guilty about, and yet they don't see an easy way out of it. So that's part of the experience of sin. We also talk about sin as being in certain individual actions. So many of us of a certain age will remember we used to talk a lot about actual sin in the Catholic tradition. This was sin that we didn't inherit. This was sin that somehow gets expressed in and embodied in individual actions that we commit. And finally, and I'm going to talk about this at the very end of our presentation, increasingly today, we talk about sin as being present in the very way in which human beings organize themselves in societies, the institutions, the associations, the collectives that we find ourselves part of in our social lives, that too somehow embodies sin. So we talk about this reality of evil in our lives in very different ways, and we call it all sin. And so that alone should tell us that we're dealing with something here that's quite complex and not easily reduced to a single neat definition. Dave, if we go to slide 3. And here, let me just make this point. That unlike if we were talking morally about something, we're making an argument about the morality of X, there we use terms like good and bad, right or wrong, and that's language that anybody can use. Whether you're a religious believer or not, people are familiar with language that uses terms like good, bad, or right, wrong. And certainly in legal contexts, we're used to using terms like crime or felony or misdemeanor. That vocabulary is at least somewhat familiar to all of us when we're engaged in legal discussion. But when you use the word sin, you are irredeemably and irrefutably in the realm of religion. Because sin language always puts the mystery of evil into our relationship, the context of our relationship with God. Sin talk is always religion talk. It's about some aspect of our relationship with God that needs correction, reform, change, conversion. Now, very quickly in the past, 2 simple examples of how we've talked about sin in the past that is with us to some extent today. One common way, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago at church at St. Vincent's, when we were dealing with the whole experience of leprosy in Hebrew religion, where it was presumed if you were a leper, you somehow were guilty of sin, or your parents were guilty of sin. And we saw that again this past Sunday in the gospel about the man born blind. One of the questions that Jesus' own disciples put to him is, who sinned, the man or his parents? So there has been this, might say, kind of alliance of thinking where you find evil and sin it's going to get manifested or exemplified in some sort of physical experience. It might be an illness like leprosy or the like. It could also be that you broke some taboo. So in the ancient Hebrews, for a man to come into contact with a woman's menstrual flow was to make the person impure. You were defiled by touching menstrual flow. If you touched a dead body, you became unclean. And you needed to somehow cleanse yourself of this. And so it's why in the ancient world, there's often some sort of emphasis on animal sacrifice or some sort of symbolic burning of things, because fire purifies. It refines gold, it refines silver. And the idea was fire refines even the person. So, quite frankly, there are some overtones of this kind of way of thinking about sin in the way Catholics talked about purgatory, that one had to somehow endure a kind of fiery purification in order to one day be able to go to heaven and be united with God. Sin as stain is part of that Hebrew heritage. Another way of talking about this that was very common, even more than the first, a very common way of talking about crime, or talking about sin in the Catholic tradition, was sin as crime. That sin was involving breaking God's law. That the experience of sin was God had laws, and when you broke them, you were guilty of sin. It might be the law about missing Mass on Sunday. It might be a law about disobeying your parents or not honoring your mother and father. There were all sorts of ways that you and I, with many of us at least of a certain age, we were taught as children that you might say the governing image or metaphor for us when we thought about sin was we performed a sort of quasi-criminal act. We violated God's laws. We had to go and acknowledge that, confess it, and get our penance, get our penalty, our punishment that would then get us back in right relationship with God and others. So we could say a lot more about that and some of the problems with that language, but I don't want to belabor it because I want to move on to more helpful ways of talking about sin. But my point is simply, we have always talked about sin metaphorically when we talk about it. We have always used some sort of images or metaphors to try to get at what is this mystery of evil in our human experience. And as I suggest, two very common ways in the past were to think about sin as a stain, as some sort of taboo that makes us unclean or defiled. And especially in the Catholic tradition, it was sin as crime, that you had to go through a sort of almost juridical experience of going, naming your crimes, confessing them to a priest, receiving a penance to atone for the penalty you paid, and then you're declared that you've paid your dues. You're like a criminal who spent time in prison. You come out, you've paid your obligation to society, you move on. Dave, let's go to the fourth slide.
Okay, I'm just first going to do one. I guess on do okay. I want to make sure, or on speaker view. I want to make sure on that. I saw something, but let me get it back. All set.
So now let me just say a few words about some of the other biblical language of sin that's there. And here I'm just going to give you an idea of how the Hebrews used certain images to talk about sin besides sin as stain and sin as crime. There were other ways that they talked about it. These are three Hebrew words, Hatar, Pesha, Awan. They were perfectly normal everyday words in Hebrew. They weren't religious terms. They were words that made sense in everyday vocabulary of people. If you were an archer, or if you were in a British pub, you playing darts, and you shot your arrow or threw your dart at the target, and maybe you hit the target, but you don't hit the target dead center. Maybe you hit one of the outer circles of the target with your dart or your arrow. That would be the experience of Hatar. Hatar was the idea that you're not quite hitting the bullseye. You're not dead on. You're not really getting to the center of things. You might be in the ballpark, but you're not really right on. Hatar is this idea of, I missed the mark. I'm not entirely wrong. I'm not hopelessly lost, but I'm not exactly where I should be. I'm not really, my heart's not completely in the right place. This was often used by the prophets to convey this idea that, well, I love Yahweh, but I also love a lot of other things. And you see, this goes back to, underneath those three words, I have another Hebrew word there, hesed. This is the context for thinking about sin in the Old Testament world. Frequently, when you and I hear a passage from the Old Testament read and the word love is used, the word that we're translating as love is hesed. And it is love, but it's a certain kind of love. Because again, we use the word love to cover lots of things. Just tonight for dinner, I had a slice of pork loin, and I said to the cook, I love this. It was delicious pork. Well, loving pork loin and loving my best friend, or loving my spouse, and gee, I love that movie. We're using love in a variety of ways here in degrees and inflections. So what hesed means in the Old Testament tradition is it's best understood with a modifying word, either faithful or loyal. Hesed is faithful love. It's loyal love. So if you happened to see the readings for today at Mass, the first reading today is from the prophet Isaiah. And Isaiah is talking to the Hebrew people after they're coming out of their experience of the Babylonian captivity and getting ready to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their way of life after being in exile for decades. And Isaiah sort of speaks to them as God would speak to them. And Isaiah talks to the people and saying, you thought that when you were in captivity, you thought that when you were being punished, that I had turned my back on you, that I had forgotten you. You thought I no longer cared for you. And then Isaiah puts into Yahweh's mouth the following words. He says, he uses the image of a mother and child. It says, can a mother forget her child? Can a mother forget the child in her womb? And then says, and even if a mother should forget her child, I will never forget you. Yahweh says, I never broke covenant with you. I never walked away from our relationship because my love for you is faithful. It's loyal. I never break it. And the prophets would often criticize Israel for saying, Yahweh loves you with a faithful love, but you love with a love that's marked by Hatar. You may care for Yahweh. You may have nice thoughts about Yahweh. You might, admire some things that Yahweh has done or be grateful for the things Yahweh has done. But you don't love Yahweh the way Yahweh loves you. you're not quite on center. Your heart doesn't point due north. It's a little askew. You've got split loyalties. You have other things and other things that you love at times even more than you love Yahweh. That's Hatar. A second way that the Hebrews would talk about sin using the word Pesha. And Pesha is simply a word that means rebellion in the context of the ancient world, which was essentially a tribal society. And in the ancient world, there's a clear social hierarchy. Everyone knows who the monarch is, the king or the prince. Everyone knows who the nobles and aristocrats are. Everyone knows who are those who work in the royal court. And the idea was it was a society structured on a whole series of personal loyalties. The king had an obligation to care for the people placed under his tutelage. That within a kingdom, there might be broken up and certain princes or other lords who are put in charge of a given tribe, a given group, or a given region of the kingdom. And people received pledges that they would be cared for, they would be defended, they would be protected, they'd be looked out for by the ruler. But the flip side of that was the people owed loyalty to their lord. The old phrase was your liege lord. Who do you have mutual responsibilities towards? The king will rule me fairly, and I, in turn, will defend the king. So if the king says we have to go to war, I'm ready to serve in the military. If the king says we have to ask for everyone to donate certain proportion or percentage of the harvest to pay for certain things, I have to pay my fair share of those taxes. Whatever it may be, the king issues these laws, I have an obligation to obey them. That relationships in society were seen to be relationships of a covenant of mutual duties and responsibilities. When a person breaks that bond, when I take all the benefits of my covenant with my Lord, but the Lord then asks me to do my side, and I say no, when the king says, we're going to war, I need you to show up next week with your chariot and you're ready to fight, and I head for the hills and hide out in the cave, I just engaged in Pesha. I have refused to live up to the obligations that flow from my covenant bond with my ruler. That's Pesha. And the Hebrew saw part of the experience of sin is sometimes we rebel against Yahweh. We don't live up to what Yahweh asks of us. We take all the blessings that Yahweh gives, but we want none of the duties that Yahweh may impose. Chief among those duties is caring for the weak and the vulnerable in the society. I don't worry about the poor. I don't care for the widow, the orphan, the alien in the land. I look out for myself and my family. I don't worry about the rest. And that's frequently what the prophets hold up to the Hebrew people, that you are breaking covenant with Yahweh, because Yahweh makes that our duty, that we should look out for the vulnerable and the weak. And when you refuse to do that, you're rebelling against the covenant bond of faithful love. And finally, there is the image of Awan. You know, in the ancient world, again, this is not a world that has anything like the healthcare we come to expect, right? And yet it was a world in which just everyday life was tough. Right? There weren't paved roads. There weren't smooth sidewalks to walk along. There were lots of holes. There were tree limbs you could, or tree roots you could stumble on. There were rocks you could fall upon. There were lots of opportunities for people to break a bone, to fall. There was heavy physical labor to be done, even in working in a small farm or herding animals. You could pull a tendon or a muscle, you could hurt your back. And there was no CVS to go to and buy a bottle of Aleve that you could gulp down for your back pain. There was no surgery that's going to neatly resolve a ripped ACL or something like that. Instead, many people spent the rest of their days after an injury dealing with some lingering misset bone or ripped tendon or pulled muscle. And people frequently, at some point in their lives, experienced a certain amount of being twisted or crippled in their bodies. It could have been what we would today say is rheumatism or arthritis. No ready cures for that then. And so it was a very common experience for people to experience their bodies as in some ways a limitation, that I wasn't free to move the way I used to be. I'm no longer a vigorous young adult. I'm now old. I'm tired. I'm crippled. I got aches and pains that prevent me from moving the way I used to move, from working as freely as I used to be able to use my hands in as dexterous a way as I once did, to hear someone speaking or singing, no hearing aids, right? Losing my sight, no glasses. That the experience of limitation, physical limitation, was very common in the ancient world. And that experience was to be Awan. And what the Hebrew meant by this was, when they put it in the context of using it in sin languages, that sometimes you and I simply cannot do all that we'd like to do. That you and I simply no longer have the strength or the ability to do what we would like to do. And it may be not just a physical limitation, it may be that I am so enveloped in a situation or a context of violence that it's very hard for me to resist being violent with others. It may be that I have lived a life in which I've been, something of a glutton, or I've drunk too much over the years. And it's not so easy to simply say, okay, I'll no longer drink. That wine has a power over me. It's hard for me to refuse that wine. It's hard for me not to overeat sometimes. It's hard for me to put in a full day's work if I have spent a good deal of my life trying to avoid work. So that sometimes we are limited. Language we might use today would be vices, right? We become so enamored of our vices that it's very hard to break out of them. So that the experience of Awan is this experience of we are not always as free as we'd like to be to choose and to live the good. That's also part of the Hebrew experience of sin. Dave, if we could go to the next slide. Now, if you move to the New Testament fairly quickly here, let me just say, if you look in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you see several things that are apparent in Jesus's attitude towards sin. First, it's very clear Jesus believes evil has a power over people. Think of how often in the New Testament Jesus comes across situations where we're talking about him performing exorcisms, where he is trying to drive evil out of a person's life, right? So in that age, this was oftentimes this power was personalized as, oh, there were demons or there were devils who possessed the person. But what we were talking about is this experience that evil does have a hold over people. And Jesus' ministry reflects that. A second point, throughout his preaching, Jesus consistently, we'll talk more about this next week, Jesus consistently calls people to conversion. And conversion for Jesus is not sometimes the way we think of religious conversion. Oh, I'm going to enter the Catholic Church, or I'm going to go join the Lutherans or something. For Jesus, conversion is fundamentally a kind of dramatic change in the direction of your life. I used to think X was important, and I aimed my life towards the attainment of X. And then all of a sudden, I realized at some point in my life, X is not a worthy goal. I now pursue Y with my full strength and power. That's the experience of conversion. And for Jesus, once he introduces people to the idea of the reign of God, his presumption is, once I offer you entry into the reign of God, all the other things that had a claim on you will recede in their attraction. We'll talk more about this next week. A third thing that Jesus manifests is that forgiveness of sin is possible. Again and again in the parables, Jesus tells stories about people who are able to turn their lives around. Perhaps the greatest example of this is the famous parable of the prodigal son and the gracious father. The interesting thing here is, notice that the eldest son in that parable, if you remember, when he comes back to the house and he sees that his younger brother has returned and his father is throwing this big gala banquet to celebrate his brother returning, the son says to his father, the elder son says, "Look, all these years I have slaved for you and never disobeyed your orders, yet you never offered me a young goat to celebrate with my friends." Notice the elder son. The ideal is expressed in public order. I obeyed you every time. I kept the rules in this family. Notice what the younger son says. After he goes off and spends his money and makes a mess of his life, he returns, and we're told the father sees him and goes rushing out to him. And the younger son says to his father, "Father, I have sinned against God and you. I no longer deserve to be called your son." The younger child realizes the real evil here is I broke the relationship between my father and me. I don't deserve to be a son anymore. I don't deserve or have the right to call you father. The younger son gets the real problem of sin. It breaks asunder covenant relationships. But notice what the father said to the son. You can almost see him kind of like batting it away. It's like, get out of here. And he says to the servants, get a robe, put sandals on his feet, bring a ring for his finger. The ring, of course, is the signet ring, the ring that the heir to a father would have, the family crest, the family ring. In other words, the father immediately is, of course you're my son. Come on back. We're going to have a party to celebrate that you're alive again, that you are one with me. For the elder son, sin is breaking the rules. For the younger son, it's breaking a relationship. And for the father, that can be forgiven. That can be welcomed. The grim reality of sin, forgiveness is always possible. That's the teaching, and for many people at the time, the surprising teaching of Jesus. You don't have to offer some fantastic sacrifice of an animal in the temple for God to forgive you. You simply have to turn to God and acknowledge, I am in relationship with you. I'm not worthy of the relationship, but we are in relationship and we can be forgiven. And then finally, it leads to the teaching of Jesus that therefore we ought to be compassionate with sinners. The first thing we think about when confronting sinners is not, what's the penance I'm going to give them? It's not, will I or won't I give them absolution? Will I or won't I forgive them? The first stance we should have as Christians towards our sisters and brothers who acknowledge their sinfulness is compassion. welcome back to the family. Come on in. We've missed you. We want you back in the clan. David, we go to the next slide, please. Now, if you move beyond the Gospels and go to Pauline language, I'll be very brief here. Paul, the image Paul has, and he has several images, but Paul tends to use the term sarx, and sarx is simply one of the Greek words for flesh, for human flesh. The human body is sarx. But there's another Greek word that is the same thing for body or flesh, and it's soma. Paul tends to, and I'm not going to say he always is consistent in this. He's writing over the course of many years, and he's not always consistent in his vocabulary. But generally speaking, Paul uses sarx to talk about the human condition, our human bodies, our human environment. Paul uses sarx to talk about the human as unredeemed. He uses soma to talk about the human as redeemed. So some people get the idea that Paul is anti-physical or anti-body, that he's too spiritual and doesn't deal with the flesh and the historical reality of life. But it's because they don't understand that Paul is using two words. And sometimes in English translations, all you get is body, and you don't get unredeemed body or redeemed body. They just translate both sarx and soma sometimes in English as body. So Paul will talk about, oh, my terrible flesh, my flesh that is the source of my evil, the flesh that is sinful, that we have to renege and punish. He's not talking in a kind of anti-physicality or anti-sexual, or that he hates worldly things or physical things. He's talking about unredeemed life. When you look at life from an unredeemed perspective, it sarx. When you look at life from a redeemed perspective, it's soma. So for Paul, the language of sarx is that so often in our lives, sin is like a virus. It infects us. It weakens us, and we have a hard time overcoming it. It's a factual reality that you and I sometimes find it very hard to build relationships. We find it hard to forgive people who've hurt us. We find it hard to let go of hurts, to let go of our pain. We'd rather wallow in that and look for vengeance than offer compassion. Paul understands that. And when he's talking about that dimension of our lives that holds us back, that keeps us from being all that we'd like to be, he talks about and complains about my miserable flesh, but he's talking about sarx. Okay? The Johannine language, I won't extend this. This past Sunday, we talked about just this point, right? In the Gospels. It was all about the curing of the blind man. And to be blind for John, right? To live in blindness, it's a state of existence. That's the experience of sin for John. Another word John uses for sin is the world, right? Again, he's not like Paul, he's not anti-materialistic, right? He's not that somehow you and I are spiritual and we should forget our bodies or bodily needs or the goodness of material life. He doesn't work in that binary way. He uses the image of the world as that's the place that the reign of God has not yet permeated. The world is that sphere of life where the reign of God has not yet converted it and transformed it. So to live in the world for John is to live outside the reign of God. But you don't find the reign of God in some spiritual world out there that has nothing to do with this world. It's sort of like for John, world functions the way flesh does for Paul. There's a redeemed world and an unredeemed world. The redeemed world is the reign of God. The unredeemed world is, he simply calls it the world. The thing to see here is that for John, if sin is the state of blindness or the state of living in the world, John tends to talk about sin. He doesn't talk about sins in the plural. Because if you focus on sin as a deed or an action, well, you can have many sins because you can do many deeds or many actions. But for John, the real evil in the world is not how sin gets manifested in deeds. The real evil is that you and I can be blind, that you and I can be closed off from the awareness of God's presence in our lives, that you and I can live in a world in which we pay little or no attention to the presence of God in the world. So I was thinking in terms of with the Johannine language, there was a famous theologian since passed away who had a great influence on many of us who were educated in the 60s, 70s, 80s in theology. It's a German Jesuit named Karl Rahner. And Rahner maintained that many people who are intellectually believers are really practically atheists. And he used to talk about the great challenge in the world today is not intellectual atheism, to have philosophical debates with people who don't believe. The real problem, Rana said, is practical atheism. And that is, there are many people, Christians, who have you said, oh, do you believe in God? Oh, yes. Oh, sure. Yes, I believe in God. And then if you say, can you tell me one thing in the way you live is different because you believe in God? And at a practical level, it sometimes is very hard in people's lives. Intellectually, I believe. Does any of that translate into the way you live with people, or the way you express forgiveness, or the way you express compassion, or your concern for the poor? That many of us live as if God weren't real, even if from the neck up we say we believe. In terms of how we live, it's as if God is really not an active force or power in my life. That's what John is getting at, that the real evil is to live in a state of blindness, to live in a world where God is not really an element in my daily life, doesn't really transform and shape my daily activities, the way I live with people. Dave, if we can go to the final slide here. Let me just touch upon 4 ways today that theologians talk about sin that I find to be more helpful ways of thinking about sin than sin as crime or sin as stain or some of the other ways in which we think about sin. And just touch upon each of them, and we can discuss more in the small groups and in the larger group later on. First, this way of talking about sin as a failed relationship, this fits very nicely with the way we talked last week about basic freedom, if you remember that. Remember that basic freedom is this experience of that you and I have the freedom, the power to be self-determining. We can determine and make something of ourselves. Grace is the experience of making something of ourselves in which we choose covenant and relationship with God and others. Sin is to experience failed relationships. We really don't sustain a relationship. We don't practice hesed, loyalty, and fidelity in love. Let me just give you a simple example of this. Imagine, if you would, that you know an engaged couple, maybe neighbors, maybe coworkers, maybe in your extended family. And imagine you get an invitation to the wedding. But this couple have such fluctuations in their relationship that they're constantly calling you and canceling and then rescheduling their wedding, canceling and rescheduling it again and again and again. Would you not, at some point, question the soundness of their engaged relationship? Yes, love can die and love can be revived. but usually not with the same frequency as brushing our teeth. Right? If you think that that kind of discussion of an engagement is silly, why is it any less foolish to think that our relationship with God is any different? If we view sin from the perspective of basic freedom, then we understand the real task is, how is my relationship with God, my covenant with God, how is it deepening or how is it weakening? And either of those options can happen, but they usually don't happen on a daily or weekly or even monthly basis. And yet many of us grew up in a church that had a confessional practice that acted as if you're in grace, you're in sin, you're with God, you've broken with God, and as if this was happening all the time. When if we think about it in terms of the exercise of our basic freedom, the real question here is orientation. Am I basically growing in relationship with God and with other people? Or am I finding my relationships with God and other people going in the wrong direction? Normally, it's relatively stable, our relationships. There's going to be some peaks and valleys in any relationship, in any marriage, in any friendship, any parent-child relationship. There's good days and bad days. But the real question is the relationship perduring over time? Is it going in the right direction? It's achieved through a process. If we focus on sin as deeds and acts all the time, then you're into this idea that I'm constantly in and out of sin. But if we think of it in terms of a relationship of basic freedom, then we begin to see that the real question is, am I reinforcing and strengthening my relationship in my daily life? Am I weakening and undercutting the orientation of my relationship? Human beings, generally speaking, are not capable, as we talked last week, about self-determination in one action. Some actions are far more important than others, right? Choosing my life partner is obviously a far more important choice than cornflakes or cereal or bagels in the morning. So there are differences in the importance of certain choices and certain deeds that we do. But normally speaking, we don't sum up our entire life in one action or one deed. So I'd like to suggest to you that you and I don't take on the identity of sinner or the identity of disciple just by one action. It's really a question of process and orientation over time. That's not to say that our identity and our relationship can't be affected by deeds that we do. And this should make us rethink the idea of venial sin. Those of us who remember that language of venial and mortal sin. The traditional teaching was no amount of venial sins equals one mortal sin, right? I'd like to suggest to you that that's wrong, right? Because for most of us, we change our identity and we change our relationships, not through any one dramatic action, although that can be, but it's not the normal way. I've lived in many places over the course of my life, and I've been part of many communities over the course of my adult life and made many good friends and had many blessed relationships in my life. When I look back at it now, there are some relationships that are not as strong as they once were. And why did they weaken? It wasn't because I rejected the other person or the other person rejected me. It was that, well, I didn't make as many phone calls as I used to make. I didn't write letters or send a Christmas card after a while. At vacation time, I didn't travel to see that person or that family. No one thing dramatically altered the relationship, but over the course of years, I see people with whom I still have fond feelings, for whom I still feel affection, and they for me. But the level of intimacy, the level of kind of shared understanding and shared life, it has changed over 10, 15, 20 years because we simply have not kept up in communication, in correspondence, in daily interactions, because I moved around. I wasn't as good on the phone as I should have been. This person was too busy raising their kids. They didn't have time to visit me or me to visit them. I'm caught up with my teaching. And gradually the relationship changed. It didn't just fall apart, but it's not as close a relationship as it once was. Most of us don't become serial killers. Most of us do not throw orphans out of a house to sell it to some real estate developer. Most of us don't do horrible deeds that change our lives in a snap. But over the course of our lives, we can become a little more callous to somebody who's suffering. We become a little tired of hearing about, oh, another drought in Africa. Isn't that the 30th drought I've heard about in my lifetime? I'm tired of droughts in Africa. Oh, yeah, there's racial injustice. Oh, yeah, but I mean, how much of that do I have to spend thinking about? After a while, we can just grow hard. We can grow callous. We can become indifferent. We change, not necessarily dramatically, but through little acts of not caring enough. And put enough gestures of not caring enough. And after a while, I'm not as compassionate or gentle or loving a person as I might have been. Sin is a state of existence. Here, I simply want to suggest a reality that I think St. Augustine captures very nicely in his famous Confessions, the book that Augustine wrote, in which he's reflecting upon his own conversion. And at one point in the Confessions, he tells the story about himself as a young man with some of his friends, that they're passing a garden that belongs to someone else. And the garden has a pear tree, and there are pears hanging from the garden. And Augustine talks about that he stole several of the pears. And he looks back and he asks himself years later, why did I do that? And he says, I wasn't that hungry. I didn't really need the pears. And the truth is, I don't particularly like pears. I didn't really want the pears. And it wasn't that I knew who owned the pears and I was trying to spite that person or get revenge for a certain reason. And he says, why did I steal the pears? And the answer he comes to is, I delighted in doing something that was forbidden. I liked the sheer mischief of it. There was something about doing something wrong that just made it seem exciting, dangerous, fun. It made me a celebrity among my friends. What Augustine faces is there is something within me that I love the wrong itself. I simply didn't care about the past, but I loved doing what was wrong. If Augustine were alive today, I think he would appreciate a cartoon that I saw once in New Yorker magazine. It's a huge auditorium, and there is a person on a stage, up on the stage, at a podium, starting to speak. And the audience is this huge auditorium, and there's one person in one seat sitting there listening to the speaker. And behind the speaker is a big banner. And the banner says, "Welcome to the convention of children raised by normal parents." And Augustine's point is, we all know how to foist blame on others. I'm screwed up because my parents screwed me up. I'm screwed up because of that lousy teacher I had in the 5th grade. I'm screwed up because I hung out with the wrong crowd when I was in high school. I'm screwed up because I got treated badly at my first job. I should have got the promotion and they screwed me out of it. We all can find reasons to excuse ourselves from our wrongdoing. We're all very good at sort of laying the blame outside of ourselves. It's because of my economic condition or my family background or my propensity towards chemical abuse, so whatever it may be. We all can invent reasons where the source of evil is outside of ourselves. What Augustine brings home to us in that little story of the pears is not that he was hung up on one act that he did, but that act for him was terribly symbolic because it reminded him the source of evil in my life is within me, right? I am attracted to evil. There is something about wrongdoing that has an appeal to me. And unless we can face that reality of ourselves, we never really come to terms with the full force of evil in our lives, if we keep it always outside of ourselves. That leads to the third way of talking about evil and sin, and that is, this is very much the Pauline way of thinking about it. Sin is a virus. Sin is a power that grows on us. It becomes a bad habit, right? So that it's very hard to sort of at times, right, to defuse tense situations. Somebody raises their voice and curses out another person, it's far more likely that that other person is going to respond in kind, yelling, cursing back, threatening that person. Violence breeds violence. Stinginess breeds stinginess. If I know you're always looking out for yourself in any business dealing I have with you, if I know it's all about self-interest with you, then I go into any meeting with you on God. I go into that meeting saying, I'm not going to let that person outfox me. I'm going to take care of myself. I'm going to look out for number one so that that person doesn't get the better of me. If all our relationships can breed, right, further negative responses from others, that sin has this power to kind of become this downward spiral so that it becomes harder and harder to break out of relationships that are more death-dealing than life-giving. After a while, we're trapped in a kind of back and forth that it's very hard to break through, right? That's part of the experience of sin. It's powerful. Finally, I want to just say a few words here quickly about an idea that's become very common now in contemporary theology over the last 40 years or so, 50 years, and that is sin as social sin, or sometimes called structural sin. In many ways, it's an outgrowth of liberation theologies in Latin America, because what happened was many theologians working in Latin America and to some extent in Africa and Asia, but mainly in Latin America, began to realize that many of the categories and ideas and examples that Catholic theology was using was drawing upon the lived experience of Europeans and North Americans, and that the experience of life in Latin America, with the overwhelming number of people who are living in poverty, living without economic security, their experience of life, their experience of grace, their experience of sin is going to look a little different. And so many liberation theologians began to talk about the reality of sin for many people is that they live in societies where the rules of the game, the institutions of the society are set up so that a small minority win and a large majority lose. That it's very hard to break out of the structures of poverty and neglect and poor health and political oppression, because the environment, politically and economically and culturally, in many poor nations, just sets it up that it's very hard for people to live lives and experience their innate dignity. And so they talk about this reality of sin as structural. Let me just explain it quickly, and then we'll go into small groups. The three sentences there under sin as social. Do not, let me repeat this, do not read this as a syllogism. This is not premise one, premise two, conclusion. Because then the human person as a social product is the conclusion, and that's very deterministic, right? That we are simply created by our society. Rather, read this as three equal statements. Each one is meant to counterbalance the others. Society is a human project. You and I create societies. Once we create them, they're an objective reality. The society is not just something inside my head. There really is a society out there that has laws about banking, that has policies about real estate and mortgages, that has zoning laws in suburbs or in cities, that has financing schemes for public schools, that has voting laws. There are all kinds of rules and institutions that are created that are not just in my head, they really are outside there. Society is an objective reality. And the human person is a social product. If I live in such a society, that society's laws and institutions and culture is going to have an influence on me. Now, I shape the society. Society is a human project, but the society is also always shaping me. So a simple illustration. You and I have, say, racism, or pick another ism, have sexism in our hearts. If that's true, I will create a society that reflects some of my racism and my sexism. What that means is I will create an objective reality. I'll create real estate laws that make it hard for Blacks to get home ownership. I'll create banking policies that make it difficult for women without husbands to have financial independence. I will create school financing schemes that will virtually guarantee kids growing up and being educated around St. Vincent's are going to get a whole different experience of primary education than kids growing up out here in Loudonville in New York, right? All of a sudden, we're going to create an objective reality that comes from and gives some expression, at least, to the racism and sexism within my heart. And what that means is people growing up in such a society are more likely to grow up and be racists and sexists because, well, this is the way it is. This is reality. Women are weaker than men. Blacks are inferior to whites. Blacks are more prone to criminal behavior than white people. Women are more emotional and less logical than men. We grow up in society that passes along many of the things that were in our hearts that were skewed and that got expression in the way we've created our economy, our politics, our culture, our art. And so the way movies portray women, the way art portrays people of color, the standards we have of good citizenship. So many of those things wind up being objective realities that are more than my viewpoint. And if you grow up in a society that teaches the next generation these things through its institutions, you embed racism and sexism in the world. And then you realize, you see, that even if I undergo a revolution in my own life, even if at some point I realize, oh my God, I have grown up a sexist, racist man. And even if I now commit my life to changing my attitudes, my values, my behavior, I might change. But society is an objective reality. My personal transformation doesn't change necessarily the banking policies, the educational financing, the cultural ideals, the political power system. None of that changes because of my personal transformation. That's why sin is social. It's more than just an individual's will. It's the way we create and maintain a society that can express the darkness in the human heart. Why don't I stop there? I realize I've gone long and I apologize for that, but I thought it important to try and at least give you some sense of, in terms of contemporary reflection today, how a lot of theologians think about sin today under those kind of four governing images or metaphors. That's not to say those four are sacrosanct, that there aren't better images or metaphors, or at least other ones to supplement them. Some of those images you may resonate with and say, that makes sense to me. There may be something I said in there that you say, I don't know if I buy that or I get it. But all I'm trying to suggest to you is that the vocabulary of sin has always changed over the course of time. We keep looking for different images and metaphors that capture something of the mystery of evil as we experience it in our time today in America in 2024. We might have talked about sin in America in 1950 very differently. And if we were in, South Africa in 1950, we might have talked about sin in different ways. So there's always the interaction of our faith with the culture in which it takes root. And that always demands of us that we keep looking for more and more adequate ways of describing a lived reality that we all know too well, that all of us as individuals and as communities know the mystery of evil and sin in our world.
Okay, I think we're mostly back at this point, and I know we're running a little bit late, but we'll try to have 2 or 3 questions or comments, and if people want to use the reactions, either the reactions or on the more button, we'll get you the hand. Wherever you can find the hand, if you can do that, we'll do that for about 15 minutes and get some feedback about anything you talked about or thought about. Okay, Ray, why don't you open up and
Well, I would just say that the idea of sin is looking at it as damaging relations is, well, first of all, I have to say I've never heard that before, talked about in kind of a systematic way. But while it was going on, I was thinking about, some of my own experiences, and I can see where that makes a lot more sense than a category than a long list of what I was taught with, at least as a kid, of violations of a list of rules or commandments, because the idea that by sinning you can damage relations, it puts it on it makes it kind of a daily,
I'm afraid to do too
long-term
much.
effort to overcome it, and it's also it seems to me puts an effort on what is important in trying to become a better believer and follower of Christ. So, I mean, I'm not sure I fully understand all the implications of it, but it certainly seems to be a very, very important and very useful way to think about sin.
Thanks, Ray. Any other thoughts or questions or comments at this point?
I
Okay,
also like
go ahead. Yeah.
I also like the idea of evil being within, because I don't believe in the devil. I don't believe there's any such being as the devil who's roaming the earth trying to get us all. I like that idea of it's within me and it's what I have to deal with. And if I don't deal with it, I'll spread it around.
Okay, anyone else? We have one more session next Wednesday at 7. I will send out the slides that were here. So if you're not in that, you can email me and I can get that to you. And I will see you next.
Okay,
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.